Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for having me today and for being able to go after the work that reconnects exercise. What a privilege to have that leading into this talk. So this will be a little less experiential, maybe a little heavier, but I hope it's nourishing and numinous for you all. So jumping in, situating our talk today. Here on the left of the slides, you can see some experiences of wild spaces that I've had the ability to interact with. Really appreciated Peter's talk yesterday, highlighting a lot of the wild spaces, especially as children and different phases of life that help orient us to wild experience. For me, the wild spaces have really been about both awe and humility. And that's what I bring into this talk today about rewilding. Up here in the top right, we can see there's different glimpses into rewilding. Like, it's a very buzzy, trendy concept these days. We got rewilding your body and rewilding your diet, rewilding your feet, and podcasts and TV shows. And so what I hope to do is situate rewilding a little bit and reground it, as I feel like as it's become more mainstream, it's been defanged a bit. And then down here in the bottom right, we have a picture of the tree, which you might have saw. That's how my presentation is laid out. I'm reading a book right now by Kahete on traditional ecological knowledge, and he speaks about how in the native cosmology, or the roots are the cosmology of their ecology. The trunk is the philosophy, and the branches are a consciousness that then feeds back into the cosmologies. And so that will be a little bit of our orientation today as we go through this talk. And so this idea here, somewhere something went terribly wrong, is I feel like something we all know and feel and love to explore. That's why we're here today. I got this term from this individual here, Twig, Anthony Twig Wheeler, who's a somatic educator and part of the skills gathering circuit. I originally met him at Buckeye Gathering, skills gathering on Mountain Maidu lands in California. And this quote here from him is something we'll come back to again and again in this talk today. Here on the right is this idea, somewhere and something. So what went wrong? This image is very evocative, but it's something that we've all been exploring. We just had this work that reconnects about Joanna Macy. So the Industrial Growth Society, we heard it called Babylon earlier, techno-industrial civilization, the World Eater, Mega Machine, Leviathan. So there's many names for this idea. What I really want to bring home is this graph down on the bottom left. That's looking at wild mammal biomass over the last 10,000 years. And so on the left would have been wild animals, depending on how you look at humans and that evolution. And then today, looking at how much has changed in 10,000 years, where we're down to like a very small percentage of wild mammals left. And just how how on so many levels, the despair, the disgust, the grief, but also within this talk of rewilding and wild foods, the loss of subsistence, lifeways for native land-based peoples, being cut off of their food sources, which is part of forcing them into dependency. And so that's what we're going to move into exploring here next. So when I started looking at these ideas of, this different ideas of psychosis and cultural traumas, I like to always look to the peoples of the lands that I'm on for guidance. For me, it's Anishinaabe lands here in the upper Midwest, the Great Lakes region. So they talk about Wendigo psychosis, very similar to maybe the social cultural psychosis that Sarah started us off with yesterday. And it's also known as Wetiko and other indigenous peoples, but this idea of the cannibal giant. And three characteristics of the psychosis is cannibalism, insatiability, and contagiousness. And so that's really something I want us to hold on to as we move through this idea of psychosis. The next concept I really want to bring in is another talk yesterday, Enculturated Captivity by Vaughn Wilkins. If you didn't get to hear Vaughn's talk, I highly recommend you check out his work, really revolutionary stuff. I'm not going to do Vaughn's work's service. So what I do, though, want to highlight about his work is this idea of our complex PTSD, our zoochosis, emerging from suffering due to the loss of our ecosystem, the loss of our ancestral home. As we saw on that last slide about the shifting in wildness towards humans and livestock being driven off of ancestral lands out of our wild ecosystems. And so what I want to really highlight here is this idea of domestication, the domus, the dome, the domicile, the same as Peter Kahn's talk yesterday about domination culture. So, you know, within Christianity, the dominion, but it's about the dome or the domicile, about the house. And so domestication is a process of breaking the wild will, of literally bringing into the house, of creating a dependency. Charles Glendinning talked about the fence as the ultimate symbol of this. And when we start to get fencing, there starts to be stuff that's desirable to have inside of the fence towards the house, and stuff that we're trying to keep out away from the house. And so it starts to create dualism. It's a process of othering. And domestication is very much tied up in the other emergent systems of oppression. I named some of them here. We can go on and on all the way into the stuff that we're seeing today with late stage capitalism and white nationalism. But looking at how this domestication is really a root in our captivity. Another idea I'd like to introduce here, this person, Leonard Martin. He's a psychologist at University of Georgia. He has some work in what's called ID compensation theory. And so the I stands for the immediate return nature of human evolution, of foraging, hunting, gathering societies. D is the increasingly delayed return nature of the societies that most people live in today. And then the compensation is these mechanisms. He mentions a few here. The one I specifically want to highlight is this increased need to find meaning in life, abstraction, symbolism. And so this is the result of this dissonance. And this really comes out of anthropology. And so this idea of immediate versus delayed return economies, economies being management of the home, food procurement, which, like most things, we find on a spectrum. And so on one end of the spectrum is going to be less intensity, both in the impact on the ecosystem, the impact on the land, as well as energy intensity. So human, millions of years ago, starting out scavenging, moving into foraging. A gathering is a step where all of a sudden there's more intensity. Now you're gathering to take back somewhere. So you need baskets, you need more technology, and onward and onward. And today we're in a very delayed return, which would be into like monoculture, GMOs, Monsanto, big ag. And so it's not like a either or, right? This is a spectrum. Different peoples around the world have different combinations of these. Even something like agriculture can be very low intensity versus very high intensity. So just like understanding that the way that we manage our home is also having an impact on our psyches and the way we move through the world. Finally, the part I want to add here is from emergent fields of paleoanthropology and paleo-genetics, which is starting to use all this information around epigenetics to look at our ancestral histories. Humans emerged out of Africa and spread all over the continents, arriving in Europe about maybe 45 to 60,000 years ago. What we now know from paleo-genetics is that the original European ancestors were brown-skinned and blue eyes. The person in the middle here, the Cheddar Man, his name, was an ancient ancestor of mine from the British Isles. And so what this learning has done is displace what was known as the northern latitude theory, which was the fairer the skin, the farther north you are, which never was a very convincing theory, but has since been replaced by what's known as food production theory. And so we now know that fair skinnedness emerges out of what's the so-called Fertile Crescent, sometime around 6,000 years ago, 6 to 8,000 years ago, and starts emerging into Europe, where peoples with melatonin deficiency are bringing domesticated cattle and plants into Europe, displacing hunter-gatherers. And it's the belief that the melatonin deficiency, the fair skinnedness, is a derivative of deficiency in diet, specifically wild meats, wild fish, and wild mushrooms, which are high in vitamin D. The connection I'd like to suggest here is that, fair skinnedness has been associated with whiteness, which has really taken hold here in America and become this white ideology that we're seeing today, and white supremacy, white nationalism, is actually rooted in malnutrition. And this insatiability from this malnutrition is not only spiritual, such as we've been looking at with like Wendigo psychosis, but is also a very physiological malnutrition. We know from the emergence that people coming out of the Fertile Crescent not only have this melatonin deficiency, but have bone density issues, tooth decay and tooth enamel issues, and onward into other diseases. And so there's a very real physiological deficiency here. And so I'm proposing rewilding as both an anti-racist, anti-colonial response to the whiteness by using this wild-fed diets to satiate this malnutrition. I'm going to take a brief pause here to let that all sink in before we move up the tree and take a drink. Invite you to maybe shake some stuff out, move around, remember to breathe. And so moving up into what do I mean by rewilding, right? I was saying it's a very trendy, becoming increasingly mainstream word. There's all these books about rewilding that are emerging. I'm looking at its roots specifically in radical environmentalism, 1980s, early 1990s. It kind of co-emerged into two threads, conservation rewilding and human rewilding, which really mirror the two waves of radical environmentalism. The first wave being more associated with like Dave Foreman, the radical rednecks for wilderness, restoration ecology, conservation biology. The second wave, Judy Berry, ecofeminism, the emergence of anarchism. Conservation rewilding, highly important. This idea of having wilderness cores, having corridors connecting them, and reintroducing apex predators, carnivores. We all know maybe about what's happened in Yellowstone by introducing the wolves. But also conservation is highly problematic. This idea of pure wilderness, that's really racist, and there's become an anti-rewilding movement. We see this in the UK where shepherds and pastoralists have been forced off the lands they've tended for thousands of years, or even rewilding projects and like where the Maasai live, and the Maasai being forced off their traditional lands and for quote unquote rewilding. Human rewilding, on the other hand, really recognizes that humans, while not an apex predator that we might want to be or desire to be in our current dominator role, are actually a keystone species, and that role is as tenders of the wild, ecosystem managers. And so human rewilding proposes infusing humans back into these rewilding projects through this idea of like the environment of human evolutionary adaptation. Vaughn hinted at this a bit yesterday. And this idea of, it's not survival of the fittest, but survival of the fit, those that can fit best into their ecosystem, into their ecological niche, the idea of adaptability. And so my dissertation work was looking at the 3 R's of human rewilding, ecological resistance, reskilling and land-based lifeways, and remembering through land-based ceremony and ritual. And the last question I want to bring here is like, not to demonize the past, not to demonize all these like aspects of, you know, our learning over the last like however many thousands of years. Like the wild's a scary place, right? As someone who's been out there in the backcountry, a lot of outdoor adventure, like there's definitely a reason why humans gravitated towards this idea of protecting ourselves from nature. But rewilding is really about uncovering all the things we lost in that process and starting to reclaim this. So breaking down a little bit more, when I talk about wildness, the word wild and the word willed have same origins. Gary Snyder has some really beautiful work in this area. This idea of self-willedness, autonomy, sovereignty, free agency, free association, but that happens in a congress of wills, right? We are so hyper individualistic in these cultures today about our individual autonomy, but recognizing that we're part of an ecosystem. And so everybody has a self-willedness inside that ecosystem, and we're all working together. So wilderness, not this idea, this place untrammeled by man, but this place of the wild deer, the wild animals, right? We saw that in those first slides of 10,000 years ago and the wild mammal biomass that pervades the earth. And then the right? This isn't about wilding, this is about rewilding. It's acknowledging that there's something lost. And the ing is this ongoing process like healing or even like domestication. Domestication wasn't like one monolithic event, but it's an ongoing process every day. And so everyone's probably seen these memes here, right? Like they kind of are, you know, half serious, you know, like this like go back kind of idea. And this is a big pushback against rewilding, I think. Paul Shepard talks about anyone that looks at the past is going to be labeled regressive or nostalgic or romantic. And so this is very much not about going back, but David Abram talks about, it's not about turning back the clock, it's about stepping out of clock time altogether or aligning with the present. Like Twig mentioned at the beginning, about returning to our senses, coming home to being in this world in the present moment. Kahete, and just recently I was reading, he said it's not about going back, but it's about coming full circle, you know, like less about linearity and more about the circular or spiraling nature of how the earth works. And so these are some of the philosophies around rewilding and the lineages of rewilding that I'm really focusing on here with this talk. And now getting up into the branches, into the consciousness around, well, how do we apply this? How do we apply this in our everyday? And so reskilling in wild lifeways. Here at the bottom, I'm mentioning a lot of skills gatherings and art and ecology centers and conferences that I've been part of. WildFed is actually the label of a food show by Daniel Vitalis. So this idea of getting back into our relationship to food, food sovereignty is part of our move towards sovereignty. Kahete likes to say that there are few other experiences that can develop empathy for the natural world in this way that can happen through being in relationship to our foods. The picture here on the right is me and an East-West grad, Sam Somer, at the Occidental Art and Ecology Center, making fire by friction the first time, and to feel the wildness that came in alive in us as we got that fire going is something that's hard to describe. And so the skills, but also these skills gatherings are a place for like this quote unquote proto village experimental space. So not only are we coming together to learn or relearn all these skills, we're also doing learning how to be in community again. The next concept is rewilding our pedagogies. I had used this quote from Paul Shepard a long time ago. He mentioned the numinous in here, so I decided to bring it back. Here's a bunch of nature schools, wilderness awareness schools. Vaughn was talking about wild education yesterday. Here on the far right are my little kid. The top photo is a 1-year-old harvesting chanterelle mushrooms. And then The second photo there is a now 5-year-old with little sibling who's 1, walking them to go forage mushrooms. So this year will be his 7th year harvesting mushrooms, and it's amazing how many different species he can identify and know how to harvest. And while he doesn't like eating them, he participates in the process. And so as part of our ontogeny, how can we get back into this interactive participatory relationship? And then finally, this idea of rewilding futurisms, feeding back into creating more of the cosmologies that we need for this to really take root. People mention Crouch Chalquest, dear to my heart, his idea of phantastophobia and enchantivism, but overcoming this fear of dreaming, of fantasizing. Local Anishinaabe scholar here, Amy Creed Dunn, talking about a 7th generation plan. So how do we make this a 200-year project, just like we talked about in this work that reconnects seeing with new eyes, right? So where do we want to be 200 years from now? This idea about the grandmother hypothesis and rebuilding a class of elders and grandparents that can hold intergenerational wisdom instead of intergenerational trauma. Moving back into our role as tenders of the wild. Walking the hoop again, getting back into the seasonality of our bioregion, of our watersheds, following the seasonal migrations of animals and plant harvests. And then also this idea of heading for the hills, right? The higher we are in elevation, the more resistant we are to state, recognizing that there is like tension there with the state around these concepts. And so finally, I just want to leave it with this idea of coddywampling, which I feel is like that ethos of rewilding. It's this idea of traveling purposefully toward an as yet unknown destination. And so while I don't, I don't have any necessary answers, I like to give us a little bit of that fantasy and that dreaming on where we could potentially go. So thank you for listening to my talk.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'll ask anybody online to either raise their hand or enter a question into the question area. And I'll let you know when somebody does that, but I'll pass it back into the room so you can take questions from the room.
All right, are there questions? Let me give you the mic.
Thank you so much for that, Michael. Excuse me. I'm curious, so for those of us who spend a lot of time indoors, how do we start to get back into the wild, as it were? What would you recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. I spent a few years in the Bay Area, and so I know being in the big city, also spending way too much time on computers. But I feel like it's a lot of little things. Having houseplants, interacting with animals, finding a sit spot, even if it can be outside on a porch or in a busy stoop or something. Bird language, starting to connect with the birds. I found you were working with Joanna Macy. I had the chance to spend a 10-day work that reconnects with her, and I've spent a lot of time with Joanna. And one thing I took away from Joanna was how often she was tracking and paying attention to light rays and noticing when light rays would catch dust in the air. And so I feel like all these are little instances and moments of wildness continuing to be wild, and that maybe when we're in more indoor spaces or we aren't as in deep backcountry, it can be harder for us to stay attentive to them or even attuned to them, but they are still present and there.
Anyone else in the room with a question? Okay, Jonathan, do you have anything?
I do, yeah. I have a question from Sukandra, who's going to be presenting, I think, next. So thank you, Michael. How do we rewild the human from screen time addiction to our inherent nature? What active actions are you taking for the sake of humanity now?
Yeah, so the first question makes me think of David Abram and talking about us being 3D beings and evolving in a 3D world and moving into a 2D scape. And what that does for us phenomenologically and for our proprioception and our embodiment. So I don't have any answers about the screens necessarily, but I feel like it's a very serious problem that we all need to really look at. And for me personally, in that way, I've been doing more experiential work. So I do ecotherapy, therapeutic adventure-based counseling, and part of that moving in that direction was to do less screen time, less Zoom with people, and get people moving their bodies. And then the second part of that question, what we're doing now is we're actually working on a land project that's an educational retreat center and sanctuary space. And so we do have access to wilder lands here in a region that maybe is a little more accessible financially and different things in California, and also a safer space from a lot of the climate crisis that's unfolding. We're getting a lot of climate migration here. And so I'm really into the applied, and so experimenting with ways that we can embody this and share it with others and invite them into community, invite them into rest and respite, retreat, sanctuary.
Anyone else online? Is there any other
Nope.
questions in the room?
Not at this point.
Okay, great.
Awesome. Thank you.